talk about something that I actually knew something about and had thought about in detail. Instead, I am at the whims of my bald overlord, and Clay has ordered me to give a talk on something that I've really only addressed in a brief, poorly thought out blog post. So you get to figure out whether I actually know any of this stuff or whether we're making this up in real time. And Clay is preparing himself to pull the plug if it ends up getting truly bad as we go forward. I'm pretty loud to start with, but we'll figure this out. So look, I spend a lot of my time trying to study what shows up in the agenda of mainstream media. And the way that I generally study this is I have a tool called Media Cloud that sucks up lots of newspaper stories, and I try to look at those newspaper stories and get a sense for what a mainstream media agenda might look like. But that is, at best, a proxy for what you'd actually like to study. What you'd really like to study is what's being said on television, what's being said on AM radio, which continues to be incredibly important. And instead, what you end up doing is you study newspapers because, for the most part nowadays, they're published online, they have RSS feeds, you can pull them in, you can analyze them. And so basically what you end up doing is you look for your keys where the light is best, even if that is not in fact where you draw them. Some of the classic joke of going outside the bar, why are you looking for your keys there, it's where the light is best. I think we end up doing this an enormous amount within studying social media. And I think in many cases we end up studying platforms in intense detail, not only because they're interesting, but because they're basically model organisms. There's a lot more people using Facebook than there are using Twitter. But Facebook is really, really hard to study. There's all sorts of permissioning associated with it. It's very, very hard to get the data. Whereas Twitter sort of says, hey, we've got the data, here's an API. We are a well-understood fruit fly. Use us to study genetics. And it's not to say that the fruit fly is not fantastic or fascinating, or that you can't learn a lot about genetics from it, but it is to say that it's a model organism, and you have to be fairly careful in trying to draw conclusions from other organisms just based on the one that we actually understand and that we study fairly closely. I think when we start thinking about what's going on in the social media space, there's an enormous amount of dark matter. That's actually someone's visualization of dark matter that we almost never study. I suspect that things like email forwards are probably vastly more important in shaping opinion than Twitter or even Facebook. That's extremely hard for us to get into without starting to worry about all sorts of privacy things. So I want to talk particularly about one of these dark spots, sort of one of these spots outside of where the light is shining in the alley. And that has to do with the sort of linguistic limitations of what we end up paying attention to. So everybody in this room speaks English. Many people in this room speak English as a first language. Despite speaking English as a first language, it took people a little while to understand what was wrong with that slide. English is a tricky language, we're all with it. But look, when people started studying language online, there were these wonderful statistics going back and forth. We've taken a sample, a subset of all the pages that exist on the internet. The internet is 80% English. You can actually still find this. If you do a search on Google or on Bing for what percentage of the internet is in English, you will find these aging web pages asserting that 80% is in English based on doing a random sample of IP addresses, retrieving things, sort of looking at it. It's actually very hard to find more current research on this topic. There's a good bit of research done by a think tank in the Dominican Republic that ends up estimating that English is now down to about 45%. But that's still dealing with static web pages. When you start dealing with all these web pages generated out of databases coming out of social media, it's probably well below it, for the simple reason that the people using the internet at this point are no longer majority English speaking. It's still the largest plurality, but probably not very much longer. And certainly we're at the point where there's so much social media being created in languages like Chinese that if we're not finding ways to study this in a serious way, we may actually be missing a lot of what's going on within this ecosystem. Now, what are the consequences of missing what's wrong with this ecosystem? I want to suggest a couple of things that end up happening when we end up sort of trapped by language on it. The first one that I want to suggest is around the Green Revolution and later the Green Movement in Iran. And let me just start with a disclaimer that this in no way is intended to offer any sort of disrespect to the incredible risk, the incredible bravery shown by people who got involved with the Green Movement. What this is really about is picking on the press, which ended up sort of reporting the Green Movement as invariably leading to the overthrow of the government of Iran. And in part, it wasn't hard to sort of get the narrative that that was going on, because it was very, very difficult to report on what was going on in Iran. Simple reason that Iran had banned foreign journalists from the ground. So the way in which most of us were understanding what was going on the ground was what was coming out via social media. And this was an extremely narrow channel that got amplified and distorted. There were less than 1,000, by some estimates less than 100 active Twitter users on the ground, probably 1,000 when it started, post-crackdown down to about 100. But there were massive, massive numbers, particularly of Iranians in the diaspora, who spoke excellent English, who were amplifying and sort of spreading these messages. And so you ended up with this very strange form of storytelling, where CNN would literally sit there and say, we have no way of verifying any of this, but let's read what people are saying on Twitter, and we'll use that to report what's going on the ground. And there's no doubt that there were massive protests and many, many people involved with it. But the interesting thing was that if you happened to speak Persian, as many of the people that we had at Global Voices do, you ended up with this fairly powerful counter-narrative of what was going on in conservative pro-regime blogs, essentially saying, this is a bunch of rich kids in one particular neighborhood of Tehran. There's lots and lots of people who simply assume that this is a US-UK Zionist operation. You know, we expect this to go away. And if you're reading that counter-narrative, it's not that that counter-narrative is necessarily true, but it's that those narratives put together probably get much closer to the objective reality of what was going on the ground, rather than just the English language narrative, which ends up giving you a certain bias associated with it. So one possibility on this is that if you only have that one linguistically locked narrative, you end up with a very distinct perspective on what's going on. The other thing that ends up happening is that you end up with situations that end up being sort of linguistically invisible if you're not able to pay attention to what's going on with it. What happened with the revolution starting in Tunisia this year is that it ended up being invisible in two very interesting ways. It was largely invisible in North American press, literally until the moment when the Ben Ali government falls. It's really fun to go into like LexisNexis and look for discussions of Sidi Bouzid, the town where this all starts, or Mohammed Bouazizi, the vegetable seller who immolates. You don't see either of those terms appear in the New York Times until the day Ben Ali leaves the country. The Times reports on Tunisia, they don't actually get to the heart of the story, the actual revolution, until the day that Ben Ali steps down. There's a couple other sources that do better. Christian Science Monitor does better. The BBC does better. Clark Boyd in particular hits the story out of the park very early on for the World. But for the most part, the U.S. misses it, in part because Tunisia is in particular strategically interesting, in part because you're getting the language in both Arabic and in French. I was talking with Wael Abbas about this yesterday, and he was mentioning that to a certain extent it was hard for Egyptians to follow what was going on, because most of the coverage of this is either coming out in Tunisian Arabic, which is basically incomprehensible to non-Tunisians. It's this weird linguistic mix, or in French, which most Egyptians didn't end up speaking. So you have this event that's incredibly important, and in many ways it's sort of the imagery and the video that ends up coming out of it more than the language that's important of it, because you end up linguistically locked. So if you get the language locked, you can end up invisible, or you can end up misunderstood, or sort of the two warnings about it. So in the case where you've got linguistic closure, where you've got a set of media that you have no access to in one fashion or another, what do? And the hope for what you do, well, so the first hope for what you do is you have someone who's going to navigate your way through this. So here's the story. It looks like I'm picking on the Times today. I am picking on the Times today. I do that most days. I pick because I love. The Times had this great story from John Markoff. And you guys remember when Google said, we're getting the hell out of China, we're being hacked, we're being specifically targeted. Markoff had a follow-up story a couple weeks after it saying, we figure it out, we know who's hacking us. Predictably, it's Tsinghua University, it's the best university in China. But it's also another school that no one's heard of. It's Langshan Technical Academy. And we figured out that this is a secret military academy, a huge vocational school, established with military support, trains some computer scientists for the military, operated by a company with close ties to Baidu, dominant search engine in China. Great story, great reporting. We understand where the hackers are coming from. The only trick with it is that this is Langshan Tech's website. And if you can't read it, I'll read you in translation a little bit about what's going on. At Langshan Vocational School, there are 8 academic tracks: automotive maintenance and repair, numerical control of factory instruments, computers, bulldozers, forklift, earth excavators, welding, professional cooking, beauty, hairdressing, electrical, mechanical machine repair. This is the sort of place that advertises at 3 in the morning on Chinese television, essentially. And the ad, by the way, says, do you want to learn how to drive an earth mover? come to Langshan Vocational Tech. And Chinese hackers loved this so much. They loved that the New York Times got this so wrong that there became a remix of this ad, which said, do you want to be a hacker? Come to Langshan Vocational Tech. This is the deride of China. And the only way that we were sort of able to get this counter to the New York Times story is this dude, Roland Sung, who basically spends his entire life sitting in Hong Kong reading English language media about China, reading Chinese language media and translating them, posting it up on Zona Europa, which is basically this running account of here's what Americans are getting wrong about China by virtue of the fact that they do not speak Chinese. So the first way we can try to deal with this is by trying to find guys like this and sort of reading them fairly religiously, or finding sites like China Smack that sit there and try to figure out, here's an interesting social media trend coming out of China, let's try to put it in context. Where for me this stuff gets really interesting is when you get it sort of on an ongoing basis. And this is a wonderful experiment. This is a site which is taking all the tweets from Ai Weiwei, very controversial artist, arrested multiple times. He's taken to Twitter as perhaps the least censored platform that he has access to in China. And we now have a project run by An Xiaomina and a number of friends, which tries to translate and post on Tumblr these tweets in as close to real time as possible. And this ends up being this very interesting window to one particular Chinese conversation. You're only in this conversation if you're sophisticated enough that you're getting around the firewall, that you're finding a way to follow this, but it becomes a very interesting way to sort of follow this on an ongoing basis. So the first answer in how to study what you can't read is you find someone who can read it. Duh. Simple, straightforward. The second way to do it is to try to figure out how to study the structures rather than study what's going on with the tech. This, for me, was one of the most interesting visualizations that came out of the Arab Spring. This is Kovas Bagluta. The blue entities in this are an interlinking of people who were writing about the Arab Spring on Twitter and who were speaking in English. The people in red are people who were doing this and speaking in Arabic. To me, what's really interesting, and it's hard to see on this, are the people who show up in purple. Because those are basically your bridge figures between these communities. And you have this sort of thin band of purple running between these different communities. And these people, in many cases, are sort of saying, here's what the Arabic speakers are saying, here's what the English speakers are saying, let's figure out how to get them talking to one another. One way to think about studying this space is to try to get everybody else out of the picture and take that sub-network of the folks in purple and essentially say, here's what a group of people who are lucky enough to be bilingual or connected in this conversation see as the information that needs to pass through the channel to one set or another. You might go further and sort of say, what would be really interesting is to say, what's the delta between the purple speakers and the red speakers and the blue speakers? What ends up being translated into one community or another? What ends up being a conversation that's linguistically locked in one community or another, and what ends up crossing over between the two of them? One of the guys who's done really pioneering work on this is John Kelly, who's over at Columbia, who, if you don't know his work, I absolutely recommend you sort of catch up on everything that he's done. John looks at blogs, first and foremost, and the way that he looks at it is he says, I'm going to study stuff that I don't read, that I don't understand, that I know nothing about, and I'm going to study it purely from structure. I'm going to look to what people link to. So he takes a whole set of blogs, in this case the Iranian blogosphere. He says, what is everybody linking to? And let's cluster people by common links. So the way that this ends up getting clustered is you are together in the same place if you link to the same material. Not necessarily to each other, but to outside material. And he's able to sort of put this in, take thousands of blogs, get emergent clusters, and then he sits down with someone who actually speaks the language and says, what are these clusters all about? And when we did this for the first time in 2008, he was able to say, well, there's a group that we all knew about. There was going to be a conservative group. There was going to be a secular group. No one really had any sense, except of course for the Persians, that there was this massive block talking about Persian poetry, largely disconnected from the rest of the Iranian blogosphere. And that actually there's very visible fissures within these conversations. That Ahmadinejad ends up closely connected to the sort of conservative politics, but there's a group of religious youth, particularly those interested in the return of the 12th Imam, who are actually quite separate and sort of engaging in their own political dialogue, roughly aligned with the conservatives, but sort of further out than that. We've been trying to do some of this same work between MIT and the Berkman Center using the Media Cloud platform and sort of turning it on the Russian blogosphere. What this is basically a map of how close or how far different media we've collected are from core Kremlin narratives. So take what gets talked about on the Kremlin's website, take what gets talked about on the websites of different ministries within Russia. Take that text. All you really need to know about Russian is you just need a decent stemming library. Because all you're doing is basically text similarity, and you're trying to figure out who's close and who's far. When you simplify this out, you end up with this really strange picture. You end up with very, very close linkage between all the government entities, all of these lines. You end up with TV basically being as close to the government as actually some of the government agencies. TV is so closely government controlled within Russia that you actually have TV stations following the Kremlin better than the Ministry of Defense is. When you get out to the bloggers, you're way the heck out. And what we've done by sort of digging into this is we've been able to find out that not only are the bloggers sort of an alternative public space to what's going on in Kremlin conversations, there are two alternative public spaces that have almost nothing to do with one another. There's a liberal side and there's sort of an ultra-nationalist side. Both of them are massively far from what's going on in the Kremlin conversation. It's not that the Nashi folks, the sort of pro-nationalist folks, are following Kremlin's orders. This is not the 50 Cent Party. This is a bunch of crazy guys who are about as far out as the guys on the left are. What's particularly interesting about this is we looked at a set of posts specifically dealing with the Arab Spring, and we looked to see whether we could see this pattern within the English language blogosphere rather than the Russian language blogosphere. In Russia, we found again, TV's really close, a few bloggers are really close, lots and lots of bloggers way the heck out there talking about something entirely different. We did not see the same thing at all in the US. The dialogue about the Arab Spring within the set of US blogs we looked at was incredibly close to what the White House ended up saying and incredibly close to what mainstream media was saying, which offers this possible intriguing scenario, which is to say that the Russian blogosphere is far further from a mainstream media narrative than the US blogosphere ends up being, at least within the subset that we were talking about. So here's the thing that I am most obsessed with at the moment. This is an amazing tool put together by a guy at Hong Kong University. His name is Cedric Sam. Someone hired this guy immediately. Just grab him now before he gets away from you. He's built a great tool called Weibo Scope. Weibo in this case is referring to Sina Weibo. It's the short messaging system. It's analogous to Twitter. I'm going to make the argument that it's better than Twitter in some ways. Not only does it have the 140 character support, not only does it have built-in URL shortening, but you can associate image or video with every post. And most people do. So you end up with this incredibly visually rich medium used by about 350 million Chinese users. And it's becoming incredibly politically important. It moves so quickly, a la Twitter, that it's actually very hard to censor. And so much of the information about the high-speed rail crash that came out recently came out via Sina Weibo. Now, Cedric looks at this and says, I've got a lot of English-speaking friends. They have no idea what the hell is going on in this. It would be really nice to open it up for them. Why don't I simply take the images? So what Weibo Scope does is takes a subset of incredibly popular Weibo users and tries to figure out what they are talking about, and then ranks it by how many of these very popular users are talking about it, and then gives you a visualization of it. And what's interesting about the visualization is you start seeing some interesting similarities. For those of us who care about cute cats and their impact on global politics, there is no shortage of Chinese cute cats. These are Mandarin-speaking cats. These are not English-speaking cats. There are cute cats throughout. They appear in all places. For those of us who care about global memetics, it's very, very easy, very, very pleasing to find Success Toddler in there, sort of showing up. And in fact, you can see a lot of what ends up being hot on Reddit showing up on Weibo within a couple of days, or sometimes going back to very old stuff. Lately trending was the Seagull who goes and steals the Doritos out of the store. But the really interesting stuff is periodically you come up with an image like this, and you go, wait, what the hell just happened? And you start digging into these images, and it's not actually all that hard based on reading some current China headlines and doing a little bit of research to discover pretty quickly that this is the guy who heads up Mengyu Dairy. Mengyu Dairy was in the news at the time that this started trending, because they had admitted that a large amount of the milk that they distributed had been tainted because they'd been feeding cows bad feed. Mengyu Dairy was also the firm responsible in the melamine incident where Chinese companies started pouring lots of melamine into their milk as a way of elevating the nitrogen count, which was a way of trying to make protein detectors say there was more milk in it than not. And so, Genshen and Yang ended up being censored pretty quickly on Weibo. It's very hard to talk about them by name, but it's much harder to censor a cartoon. And at a certain point, the cartoon ends up having significantly more political impact. And those of us who try to study Chinese memes get very, very used to dealing with really weird imagery. This is Ai Weiwei on the left, who is covering himself with a stuffed llama. And the llama is not, in fact, a llama, although it looks like a llama. It is a grass mud horse. And the grass mud horse has this very interesting symbology within the Chinese blogosphere at this point. The phrase grass mud horse is a homonym, an incredibly offensive and explicit epithet about one's mother's anatomy. And the way that this sort of came into play was Chinese bloggers taking a chorus of children and having them sing the ballad of the grass mud horse. And so you had these cute Chinese kids singing this song that's technically about a grass mud horse, but is basically saying, fuck your mother, fuck your mother, fuck your mother, as a way of saying there's no way to censor us as long as we can find creative ways to use this speech. So what's great about Weibo is that if you start using it in this way via Weibo Scope, you're going to get incredibly boring shit. You're going to get the pop stars, and you're going to get the actresses, and you're going to get Chinese soft porn. And every so often, you're going to get something incredibly strange that sort of ends up being this invitation to dig in and try to figure out what's going on until Trisha Wang digs in and tells you what's really going on. But the point that I'm actually trying to make on this is a fairly simple and straightforward one. If you look at the scholarship at this point, you look at the well-respected papers out there on Twitter, they're cited hundreds of times. One of those articles is cited almost 700 times at this point. The most cited article I've been able to find on Weibo, it's a great article, by the way, it's currently cited by 9 people. We're missing something here. And it makes perfect sense that we're missing it. It makes perfect sense that this is hard to study. But at a certain point, we're missing a chunk of our ecosystem if we don't find a way to study what people are talking about and discussing in other languages and bring it into our dialogue. At this point, I should have a predictably multilingual thank you slide. I don't, so I'm just going to stop here.
Step down for a couple of questions.
Or none.
I'll use moderators for, go ahead.
So something that pops into mind is actually relevant to us because we got our website out there, and 60% of the people who showed up are speaking another language, much to our shock. And we could all of a sudden frantically look up machine translators so we can find out what the heck they're saying. So totally timely. What is the role of machine translation in trying to do what you're talking about?
So within the Weibo Scope product, one of the nice things is you click on this image and it will immediately come up with the text that accompanied it, and it'll feed it into Google Translate. And what you're going to find is that 3 times out of 5, the translation you get is just totally incomprehensible. And this depends on language, right? I mean, Google's getting better and better by the day. I would certainly say for Romance languages, it's readable 95% of the time. For Arabic, it's less than 50. Chinese is also sort of less than 50. You can sometimes get a clue about it, and then you sort of end up following this chain and sort of trying to figure out, who's this image, who's this figure. I think machine translation is going to get a lot better, but I think one of the ways that machine translation gets a lot better is human translation, which is to say that to get to machine translation, you need really big parallel corpora. And one of the ways to get really big parallel corpora is by getting people to actually take on the active translation. One of the things that I'm sort of perpetually shocked by is that if you look at the Chinese blogosphere, there's great efforts to translate English content. There's this amazing site called Yiyang that produces thousands of translations a week of English language content. If you want to read Write Web in Chinese, it's there within a day or two. We do not appear to have any sort of parallel effort that's doing this on the other side. But I guess what I would say is on the automated side of this, you can wade your way through certain languages until it starts getting into the culturally complicated stuff. For other languages, I think at a certain point, you have to make the investment in trying to figure out how you work with someone. That might be someone being Mechanical Turk, who you're establishing a relationship with and saying, hey, these are things that are coming out that we really need to know about. Or it may be hitting a point where you're saying, if 60% of my commentary is coming in from Japanese speakers, this is a really good time to hire Japanese speakers. what I'm amazed by is that we're really slow on this. You know, I've been watching sort of how Facebook deals with abuse, particularly around Arabic language groups getting taken down. It's taken that company a while to figure out how to get an Arabic speaker in on their abuse team, which needed to be a very high priority early on. I'm sure Wael is going to talk about some of his experiences with YouTube and having videos taken down on YouTube because no one understood that these people being tortured were being tortured by the police, and that this was incredibly important material to get out there.
I would add to that the use of the translation stuff is just exploding. I mean, the big translation the curves just look like those in terms of usage. I'm sure Google says the same. So there's really a huge.
It would be really great if someone would release that data, because I've been trying to.
I think we publish it.
I'd love to get that from you, because that documenting that there is that interest in crossing the border would be very, very exciting.
Ethan, do you have any sense of what percentage of the human readable web is actually now machine language? In other words, because yesterday we saw the lady from Twitter showed us examples of tweets that were entirely optimized for algorithms, right? And they were incomprehensible to a human being. I would imagine that as we all compose searches every second that are essentially being composed to be optimized for an algorithm. How much of the human readable web is now, we hit these pages that are completely incomprehensible, and when you figure out that this is actually being created for a machine.
It would be a much better question to put this somewhere. So the question, as I understand it, is what percent of web pages at this point are now being created not to be read by human beings, but to be read by machines? So essentially leading to the point where we have
the visible web, right? What's meant to be the
visible web. What's potentially viewable as a web page, but ends up not being comprehensible by a human. And my answer is you would want to get someone who studies search engines. I mean, that's the sort of thing where you would need search engine logs and search engine queries. I am lucky enough not to, or I'm not lucky enough to work for a company that has direct access. Right. That's a hard one for me to answer. There are a couple of clever papers out there trying to figure out linguistic distribution in the human readable web at this point, and I can point you to a couple of those in that space if that's interesting to you, but it's a slightly different topic. Yeah.
Ethan, one question. How do we get Weibo Scope on the web?
Google Weibo Scope or Bing Weibo Scope, or you're not getting it?
How do you spell it?
WEIBO SCOPE. And also the guy you should be hiring is Cedric Sam, CEDRIC SAM, and no, I'm not getting any percentage of his future salary.
June, yeah, go ahead.
So you and I talk a lot about the need for not just machine translation, but like a new marketplace of actual human translators who can do a more accurate job. Who's on the leading edge of that right now? I feel like that's happening kind of slowly, but
I would say there's a really high-end marketplace and a really low-end marketplace. So the question is, who's actually paying for human translation in this space? There's sort of a high-end marketplace, which are the professional translators who have been used to working at 25 cents a word, and that just doesn't work in a web context. And so those guys sort of have a certain amount of resistance to being talked down off of that premium rate, which is a really nice place to be. The challenge appears to be coming from the bottom, which are people who are on Turk, who speak two or more languages, saying, I'll give you a rough translation of that. And that's often being done at, cents a task. And that task might be a paragraph rather than a word. So you have that giant space between the two. This is extremely high quality. This can be very low quality. But the way people are finding out how to use Turk is that you just oversample. So, if you're paying, a penny per paragraph, pay that penny per paragraph 5 times and then sort of figure out how to go in with it. The other thing that we found with this, and I know that you found this as well, Jim, is that volunteers are this really interesting sort of exception to both of it. So you would look at that sort of market economy and say there's a linear relationship between quality and what you're paying, except the volunteer space, which seems to be often higher quality than the professional translators and zero cost. And so for me, part of this is sort of trying to engender a certain amount of passion to sort of say, if you are bilingual, English, Spanish, maybe there's an opportunity to sort of come in and essentially say what's cool within the Spanish blogosphere that English speakers are not getting, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I'm going to stop now, talk to someone actually exciting, what else coming up.